In 2005, General Motors spent $5.6 billion on health care. That covered 1.1 million people, more than the total revenue of 121 companies on the Fortune 500 list. Every vehicle leaving a General Motors assembly line carried roughly $1,500 of medical costs inside its sticker price. But nobody in Detroit ever decided to become an insurance company. So how did the world's largest automaker end up as the largest private buyer of healthcare on Earth? The benefit that made a General Motors job the most enviable in America was the same one that would eventually help push the company into a Manhattan bankruptcy court. In 1950, inside a bargaining room in Detroit, it was a line item, something to trade for labor peace. And the arrangement existed at all because of a wartime accounting problem in Washington. In October of 1942, with the assembly plants in Flint and Willow Run running around the clock for the war effort, the federal government froze wages. Companies desperate for workers could no longer outbid each other on pay, so they started competing on everything else. In 1943, the War Labor Board ruled that employer contributions to insurance and pension funds did not count as wages. The Internal Revenue Service agreed those contributions were not taxable income to the worker either. In 1954, Congress wrote the arrangement permanently into the tax code. Before the war, fewer than 1 in 10 Americans carried health insurance. Within 15 years, roughly 7 in 10 did. Nobody designed that system. It was a workaround to a wartime price control, and it has outlived the factories that inspired it by 80 years. But why did the labor unions end up carrying it forward? Because in 1949, the National Labor Relations Board ruled in a case involving Inland Steel that health and pension benefits counted as wages under federal law, which made them a mandatory subject of collective bargaining. The Supreme Court declined to disturb that finding. Overnight, benefits stopped being a recruiting perk that management could hand out or withdraw. They became something every American company was legally obligated to sit down at a table and negotiate. The unions understood the opening immediately. Walter Reuther, the president of the United Auto Workers, had spent years trying to win national health insurance through Congress and had watched those efforts die. So he took the fight to the bargaining table instead. Ford agreed to fund pensions in 1949. Chrysler refused to fully fund them, and Reuther pulled his members out of the Detroit plants for 104 days. It was during that strike that he coined the line that followed him for the rest of his career, describing retirees as too old to work and too young to die. Chrysler gave in after losing roughly $1 billion in sales. But Reuther wanted more than pensions, and the executives at General Motors knew it. General Motors watched the Chrysler picket lines and decided not to bleed the same way. In May of 1950, General Motors and the UAW signed a 5-year contract. Workers got a fully funded pension of $125 a month, including Social Security, wage increases tied to the cost of living, and an annual raise of 4 cents an hour, regardless of inflation. General Motors also agreed to pay half the cost of hospital and medical insurance. Until that moment, the men on the line at Willow Run had paid the entire premium themselves. Fortune magazine called it the Treaty of Detroit, and the name stuck. Historians have since described what General Motors handed over as roughly a 20% improvement in the standard of living of its workforce across those 5 years. For a family in Flint, that wasn't an abstraction. It was a house, a second car in the driveway, and a doctor you could afford to visit. Look at what General Motors received in return, because this is the part that gets skipped. General Motors bought 5 years of guaranteed labor peace and complete control over its production lines. No annual strike threat, no union voice in plant scheduling or model changes. For a manufacturer planning tooling investments years ahead, that predictability was worth more than the roughly $1 billion the contract cost. 3 years later, in the 1953 negotiations, the union pushed further and secured group health coverage for retirees. That decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. Here's the detail nearly everyone missed in 1950. General Motors was a young company with a young workforce, and it had almost no retirees. The post-war hiring boom had filled the plants in Flint and Lansing and Pontiac with men in their 20s and 30s. When you promise lifetime medical coverage to a workforce that age, the cost in the first decade is close to nothing. There was no dedicated fund. Under the accounting standards of the era, a company recorded retiree medical costs only as it actually paid them, year by year. So the obligations sat off the books entirely, growing in the dark while the balance sheet stayed clean, and the promise had no ceiling. The contract didn't index it to a dollar figure that General Motors could cap later. It indexed it to whatever American medicine happened to cost, for however long the retiree happened to live. In 1950, that seemed like a safe bet. General Motors was building roughly half the cars sold in the United States. By 1962, its share of the American market still hovered near 50%. Any executive projecting forward from the Renaissance Center would have assumed General Motors would always be this large, always hiring, always with young workers outnumbering old ones. Two things broke that assumption, and neither had anything to do with cars. The first was longevity. A retired assembly worker in 1955 might collect benefits for a decade. A retired assembly worker in 1995 might collect them for 25 years or more, and so might a surviving spouse. The second was medicine itself. Cardiac bypass surgery, joint replacement, dialysis, and the pharmacy shelf full of maintenance drugs didn't exist in any meaningful volume when the Treaty of Detroit was signed. Every advance in American hospitals made the promise more valuable to retirees and more expensive to General Motors. So the liability compounded invisibly on General Motors' books for 4 decades, and the company became an insurance underwriter that happened to build cars. What finally dragged the number into daylight? An accounting standard. In December of 1991, General Motors had announced it was closing 21 plants across North America and cutting more than 70,000 jobs, a retrenchment that felt like the bottom. It was not the bottom. 13 months later, the company disclosed a figure that made the plant closures look like housekeeping. The Financial Accounting Standards Board had adopted a rule called Standard 106, which required companies to put the full present value of promised retiree health benefits on the balance sheet instead of recording them as they came due. Every large American corporation had to comply for fiscal years ending after December of 1992. General Motors took a charge of $20.8 billion. It was the largest write-off any American corporation had ever taken. General Motors' full-year loss came in at $23.5 billion. A record for any company in American history. Without the accounting change, the loss would have been roughly $2.6 billion. On top of the one-time charge, the company would now carry an additional $1.4 billion against earnings every year, indefinitely. That is the kind of number that makes a room of Detroit accountants sit very still. But had General Motors lost $20 billion that year? Not in any sense a plant manager in Flint would have recognized. The executive explaining it to reporters was the company's chief financial officer, a man named Rick Wagoner, who pointed out something accurate and easy to miss. The accounting change didn't affect General Motors' day-to-day cash flow at all. Not a single dollar left the building that wouldn't have left anyway. Nothing had changed inside the plants in Flint. Nothing had changed in the contracts. The bill had always been there, sitting in a drawer since 1950. The rule only turned the light on. However, once the number was public, it changed how everyone looked at General Motors. Corporations across the country began scaling back retiree health benefits, and in some cases eliminating them outright, specifically to shrink what Standard 106 forced them to disclose. By the year 2000, 1.25 million people were enrolled in a GM health plan, and the company had become something without precedent in American industry. General Motors was self-insured. It didn't pay premiums to Blue Cross and hand over the risk. It paid the claims directly, which meant the cost of every mammogram, every emergency room visit, and every prescription filled at a pharmacy counter in Ohio came straight out of the automaker's own pocket. That year, GM's prescription drug bill alone passed $1.1 billion. The company started behaving accordingly. GM executives began flying to meetings with senior leadership at AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, and Merck to argue about prescribing patterns. The company's point man on drug spending publicly complained that television advertising for the heartburn medication, Prilosec, was driving patients with ordinary symptoms toward an expensive drug they didn't need. A car maker in Detroit was, in effect, negotiating national drug policy on behalf of its own retirees. You'd think someone in Washington would have found that arrangement odd. Almost no one did. But how does a company end up with more retirees than workers? By shrinking one side of the payroll ratio while the other side kept growing. General Motors' American payroll shrank every year through the early 2000s as plants consolidated and productivity climbed, while the men hired during the great expansion of the 1960s and the 1970s kept reaching retirement age on schedule. The plants in Flint and Lansing needed fewer people to build the same number of trucks. Nobody was replaced one for one. By 2005, the scale had become difficult to describe. General Motors spent $5.6 billion covering 1.1 million active employees, retirees, and dependents. Someone held a General Motors health card in nearly every zip code in the United States. 2.6 retirees and dependents existed for every one active worker still on the payroll. And 69% of the company's health spending went to people who no longer built anything. Healthcare worked out to $1,525 for every vehicle General Motors produced in America. Toyota, assembling cars in the same country under the same medical system, carried a fraction of that because Toyota's American operations were young and had almost no retirees. Toyota was where General Motors had been in 1955. That year, General Motors lost $8.2 billion in North America. General Motors' healthcare bill came to nearly 2/3 of that figure. So did healthcare kill General Motors? If you find this kind of history worth your time, subscribe. There is a new one every week. By October of 2005, GM was negotiating hard for relief. A memorandum of understanding with the UAW shifted more cost onto retirees and trimmed roughly $15 billion from the long-term liability, saving about $3 billion a year. Rick Wagner, now chief executive, gave an interview that December that is worth quoting carefully. Wagner said it would be disingenuous to blame health policy or exchange rates for everything, and that anyone claiming those forces were not part of the problem had lost touch with reality. He noted that GM paid roughly $1,500 per car for health care while global competitors paid $200. And he said GM had not ended up there because it was stupid. It had ended up there because that was American policy, and GM had followed it. Both halves of that statement hold up. GM built cars people stopped wanting, ran too many overlapping brands, and lost market share for decades on product merit. The health obligation did not cause those failures. It removed the cushion that would have let the company survive them. But cost sharing was a bandage, and the Renaissance Center knew it. GM needed the obligation off its books entirely. 2 years later came the real maneuver. In the 2007 contract, General Motors transferred an estimated $46.7 billion of retiree health liability to a union-run trust called a Voluntary Employee Beneficiary Association. General Motors would fund it with tens of billions in cash and securities, and the trust would take over payments starting January 1st, 2010. After that, the company's obligation ended. General Motors was not buying its way out of healthcare. The company was trading an unknown number for a fixed one, and it was willing to pay a premium for the certainty. But the General Motors deal had a fatal piece of timing built into it. The company had promised to fund the trust with tens of billions of dollars it did not yet have, on a schedule that assumed it could keep borrowing. 14 months after the contract was signed, the credit markets froze. General Motors lost $30.9 billion in 2008. In November, the company warned regulators that its cash would fall below the minimum needed to operate. December brought federal loans. By February, the company had raised its aid request to $30 billion, announced plans to cut 47,000 jobs worldwide and close 5 more American plants, and watched its own auditors raise substantial doubt about whether General Motors could survive outside bankruptcy. On June 1, 2009, General Motors filed for Chapter 11 in a federal courthouse in Manhattan. The Retiree Health Trust walked into that proceeding holding an unsecured claim of $20.6 billion. It walked out with 17.5% of the equity in the reorganized company, $6.5 billion in preferred stock, a $2.5 billion note, and warrants for more, a package eventually valued near $17.8 billion. GM's bondholders, holding claims of $29.9 billion with the same legal priority, recovered roughly $8.1 billion, about 27 cents on the dollar. Many of them were individual retail investors, and their committee said publicly that the treatment was unfair. Quieter still was what happened to everyone outside the UAW. Salaried retirees and members of other unions, including the electrical workers who had built GM components for decades, received no funded trust. Some were offered coverage with out-of-pocket costs steep enough to function as a cancellation. They stood at the back of the creditor line, behind the assets of what remained of the old company, and some spent years in court trying to get it back. Whatever you think about who deserved what, the outcome turned less on the value of the claims than on who was at the table in Washington that spring. The Treasury put roughly $49.5 billion into General Motors and recovered about $38.3 billion when it sold its final shares in December of 2013. The gap, a little over $11 billion, is what American taxpayers paid. So where did all that coverage go? On January 1, 2010, the UAW Retiree Medical Benefits Trust began operating. It covered more than 860,000 people and became, on its first day, the largest non-governmental purchaser of retiree health care in the United States. The trust still exists. Today it holds roughly $60 billion in assets and still covers around 50,000 active auto workers who will become eligible the day they retire. Its funding has never been comfortable. A 2015 revision of its accounting assumptions put projected obligations near $80.9 billion against the assets on hand, a shortfall in the neighborhood of $20 billion. The obligation that General Motors spent 60 years accumulating is now a portfolio of stocks and bonds managed by trustees in a Detroit office that has to outperform American medical inflation for the rest of the century. General Motors, meanwhile, employed 388,000 people worldwide in 2000. Today, it employs about 156,000. The per-vehicle health burden that Wagoner spent a decade describing to Congress is gone from General Motors' balance sheet. It did not disappear. It moved. So what should we make of the room in Detroit in 1950? The people who signed that contract were not reckless. Walter Reuther was trying to secure medical care for men who had spent 30 years on a line in Flint, after Congress had refused to do it nationally. General Motors negotiators were buying 5 years of production certainty from a union that had shut down Chrysler for 104 days. Given what either side could see in 1950, the arrangement was reasonable. The failure was not in the promise, it was in the assumption underneath it, which was that General Motors would remain permanently large, permanently young, and permanently dominant. Every party in that room treated a snapshot as a law of nature, which leaves the question that Detroit never quite answered. When a company ties a lifetime promise to its own continued success, what is that promise actually worth? Not on the day it is signed, when everyone is confident and the plants are full. On the day 40 years later, when the market has moved, the workforce has aged, and the arithmetic finally comes due.